Yeah, I went way off the deep end during quarantine in creating spreadsheets and different formulas for trying to come up with cost of the R value of the wall assembly per square foot.
Welcome to the Fine Homebuilding Pro Talk podcast, our regular discussion with building industry professionals. This is Senior Editor Patrick McComb. I'm joined by Ian Schwandt, longtime carpenter, Fine Homebuilding contributor, and project manager. You can find the Fine Homebuilding Pro Talk podcast and the original Fine Homebuilding podcast at finehomebuilding.com/podcast. You can leave feedback and ask questions there too. Ian, thank you so much for joining me. How are you, man?
I'm doing good. Thanks for having me, Patrick.
How's your family? You recently moved to Wisconsin. What's the status of your life? How long have you been there, and what have you been doing since you got there?
We've been back here for about 2 months, and it's been interesting. We left Dutchess County, New York, which was a hot spot at the time, moved the bulk of our stuff out here and had our house up for sale. And now we've completed the house sale, and being back out here, this area is now becoming a hot spot, not the rural county that we live in, but the counties where Madison and Milwaukee are, which are only about an hour away from us, are beginning to see a big uptick in cases.
Wow.
But otherwise, everybody here is good. My family pretty much stays pretty local to this area.
And so is it your mom and dad own a farm? And what kind of farm is it?
So my parents took over my family's farm, which I think dates back to the mid-1800s. They've had it now most of my life. I think when my grandfather died, they took it over. And we do cash crops and beef cattle.
Okay. So growing up on a farm, how did you end up in a union carpentry program? Did you start in high school? Can you tell me about how you became a carpenter, please?
So we didn't really have a construction program at the high school I went to. We just had your standard metal shop and wood shop. I took mostly wood shop classes, and I took an architectural drafting class with the shop teacher, and really enjoyed that class and wanted to think about pursuing that. So I went to a local community college near our house. And after about half a semester, they sent me a letter saying that you probably don't belong here. Maybe you should get a job. And it had a tone of, it's not us, it's you. So I started going through a bunch of different jobs. My dad liked to take me and drop me off by somebody of his that needed help. So I worked in a metal shop, did some automotive repair stuff. And one day he hooked me up with a job with a group of masons who do mostly block work. But they also ran a small dealership of modular homes. And I really took to the carpentry end of it much more than the masonry end of it. And at the time, I knew a guy who was in the Milwaukee Carpenters Union, and he strongly urged me to join up, which was about a 6-month process. You have to go and take a couple of tests, and then you have to find a contractor willing to sponsor you and say that they're going to hire you. So at the end of that 6 months, I had somebody that signed the letter and went to work for a company that did commercial interiors and Pella window installs in residential homes.
I'm going to back up a little bit. What were the tests like? How does the union decide if you're going to be a good carpenter with a written test? And do they still do that?
They do. Yeah, it was all math tests. So it was math, general competency, which from what I remember, most of them were pretty middle of the road. There was some harder stuff, but it wasn't any Pythagorean theorem type things. It was more just showing that you had some level of math competency. And the union in Milwaukee was really progressive with giving anyone who needed assistance. They had something set up with a local tech school at the time to have tutors help people get through the math test. They didn't want it to be a barrier to entry.
So once you found an employer or a sponsor for your apprenticeship, how did you meet that person, and did you end up working for them afterward?
I kind of did it the old-fashioned way. I went to the union's website and I printed off the list of every single contractor that hired from the union hall, which had their addresses and their contact people, and I sent every single one of them a letter to try and get a job. And this was it might have even been the only one that actually contacted me back. I think that wasn't really a typical way that people went about it. I think guys would show up on a job site with the letter and try and shake down some foreman who, needed cheap labor that day to sign it for them. But even when I moved to New York about 4 years after I joined the union, I did it the same way. I went to the Contractors Association that was tied with the Dutchess County Union and sent everyone a letter again. And I think I got 4 or 5 responses at that time, and joined up with a commercial contractor in 2007.
When you signed up with this commercial contractor, did they drop you right in the deep end, or were you working with somebody? What degree of competence do they expect when you're, a recent apprentice?
In 2007, they gave me a small job to run at Vassar College. And then I went straight from that job to, if I remember correctly, it was about a $7 million job at Vassar Hospital. So I got thrown into the deep end pretty quick. The job at Vassar Hospital was a prime contractor job. So while we as the carpenters were the ones who we were really in charge of the job, but we weren't necessarily in charge of all the other contractors, which can make it somewhat difficult if you can't develop a good relationship with other trades.
So what kind of work were you doing in that project? And frankly, how were you qualified to run it?
I was probably horribly unqualified. We gut renovated one of the oldest sections of Vassar Hospital for, I think it might have been the maternity ward. They were expanding and adding, I want to say it was 10 hospital rooms to it. So on the surface, it looked like a really complex job, but in reality, it really wasn't. We gut renovated the whole wing back to nothing, which to my surprise, coming from the Midwest, it was all terracotta block construction, which I had never seen before. I remember all the laborers at the time really getting a kick out of this kid from Wisconsin who had zero idea what he was looking at. But most of them had a lot of patience with me. But after we got it renovated, it was just a lot of steel stud work and room dividing and waiting for the electricians and the duct installers to come through so you could sheetrock.
So you must have been supervising guys who were probably many years older than you. Did they give you a hard time? Did they show their respect?
Most of them were respectful because they didn't want the job. Most of them had done it, and I think at the time the union pay scale was maybe like $2 more an hour. So it wasn't necessarily a windfall money wise, but I enjoyed it because I got a company truck and you got paid for 40 hours a week, irregardless, which sometimes you'd have to work more, but there were, unpaid holidays that you'd get off and get paid, which at the time I thought was pretty cool. But when I first got my first crew to run, which I was a second-year apprentice running a trim job on a condo complex in Milwaukee, the guy that gave me the opportunity told me that running a crew is 10% knowing what you're doing and 90% psychology. And I've really found that to be very true throughout my career.
What do you think are the primary psychological motivators to get people to do a good job? How do you get them to do a good job and get along? That's another aspect, right?
Yeah, I think the getting along is much more important. I don't think you can do anything that sows division between the trades, first off. I saw that a lot in the union when you would have overlapping work scopes where one trade would think that it was their work and another trade would say, no, that's our work. That happened typically in backing for various pieces of electrical equipment or plumbing. And just being able to get everybody on the same page and get ahead of those things before they happen. But I've been lucky. I've never really had a crew where there were guys that didn't like each other. But I think you've been on enough job sites, you know that there are things you can do to have people working in different parts of the job and not having to work together if they don't like each other.
Did the union do a good job, in your opinion, to give you competent workers? Like, were there ever people who just didn't know what they were doing or didn't have the patience or care to do a good job?
We would get that a lot, especially on municipal work. You would get guys who they were next in line. Maybe they didn't know how to do regular framing, and you'd talk to them, and all they would know how to do is concrete form work, which is one of the union's bread and butter things. And you just have to do your best in trying to find something that they can do. And do efficiently enough to make it worth the pay scale. But that frequently happens on municipal work. Otherwise, I would say most of the guys I've worked with out of the union are very well trained. I have noticed that the way that I was trained here in Wisconsin was very different from how the guys I had underneath me in New York State were trained. A lot of the guys that taught in the school I went to here in Wisconsin had residential backgrounds. So they really wanted us to be what they would call complete carpenters, so that we would have an understanding of the commercial world, but also be able to go and build a set of stairs for your neighbor, build a deck on your house. That was a really important part in their mind of being a carpenter.
It seems like a pretty good gig being a union carpenter. And I've heard other folks say who have come through the union who have pensions and, benefits that it's a good way to go. Why did you leave?
So in 2008, I had open heart surgery to repair kind of a genetic defect in a valve. And so I was out for about 4 months from that. And when I came back, after being out in the end of 2008 and watching the crash from recovering on the couch, the only work that was left was really finishing up work that had been budgeted for and was already in the pipeline in 06 and 07. So then at the end of 09 going into 10, the work really dried up. And I was lucky enough to be living in an apartment complex, and I knew that the guy that owned the apartment complex also flipped houses. So I joined up with him and just started renovating and flipping foreclosed homes. And I think we did maybe 7 or 8 homes between 2010 and 2012. And then in 2012, kind of went out and started my own business. Looking back on it, that was a time where I probably should have went back into the carpenters union because they were back flush with work again. But I just wasn't really happy with the commercial interiors work, and was probably more idealistic than I am now, and thought that I could keep going out there and being a carpenter and doing fancy woodworking projects for people.
And so more recently, you had been working for Hudson Valley Preservation, running pretty extensive home renovations, right? And
Yep.
Can you tell me a little bit about that? Who your clients were, what the kind of projects were?
I think our clients were almost universally New York City weekenders, which were the same people I was dealing with when I was working for myself. But we did a really wide range of stuff. And Mason and Dave, the owners, are really involved in Nessie and some other green building and high performance stuff. So most of the jobs that we did always had that high performance aspect to it, which I really took to and used my living in the Northeast and the opportunities there with places like Yestermorrow and Nessie and other schooling options. I went to the Joe Stebrick class on rehabilitation and renovation. So I really picked up the high performance stuff working at HVP and ran with it with the opportunities that we had.
And then you decided to move back home to Wisconsin and build your own house, right? That's the next chapter.
Yeah, that's the next chapter, and it's one that I don't think I really ever saw coming. But about a year ago, I started to think about what the future was really going to be like staying in the Northeast, and it is a really expensive place to live, and you get to a point where you own a house and you start to realize, wow, I'm going to have to work like this at this wage forever just to keep this going. And at the time, my wife was an executive chef, was working 80 plus hours a week and starting to really feel burned out and wonder what her next chapter was going to be like. And I brought up one day, maybe we should move back and build a house and try and do something else that doesn't require this level of constant income stream to support. And of course, having gone to all the high performance stuff, I immediately started to design a high performance house because that's, all the people I had been around and all the stuff I had been doing for the last year was really pushing me in that direction.
And the house is your own design, right? Can you tell me a little about it? It's adorable. I'll start by saying.
Yeah. So I like to joke that it's the 13th house design and the 4th version of that design. So for about a year, we've just been throwing stuff at the wall, and I'd sketch something out on SketchUp and I'd show it to my wife and she'd say, I hate that, or I like that part of it. And then I'd show her something and she'd go, oh, yeah, that's really nice, but can you make it like 10 feet longer and 5 feet wider? Because I kept trying to design as small a place as we could comfortably live in, because our house in New York was really small. So I thought, wow, we only use like 2/3 of this house. Maybe we only need to build something that's 1,200 square feet. But we settled on the design we have now, which is going to look like a ranch house, but it'll have the bedrooms in the basement with the full walkout basement for the bedrooms. But the first floor will have a 45 by 20 great room with a cathedral ceiling that I'm working with an engineer right now on parallel cord trusses for the ceiling structure so that we don't have to have any interior supports or really long steel ridge beam. So we'll have this large, open, really modern great room. And my wife, because of her commercial kitchen background, has a bit of a different view on things like the kitchen work triangle and workflow. And so we actually designed the kitchen to be in 2 separate rooms, taking on like the scullery or butler's pantry idea from like colonial and Victorian times. We're going to actually have the dishwasher, sink, and refrigerator in a back room behind the kitchen, which will be in the great room of the house. And in that great room will just be her outrageous stove and a work table. And we have some maple lumber from a tree that Dad cut down on one of the neighboring farms, which I've got milled up in my shop right now. And I'm going to make all the countertops for the great room kitchen out of that material, along with some ash that I'm working on milling up right now. That'll be our cabinets.
Because building a house by yourself is not enough work. You need to make all the cabinetry and work surfaces too.
Right. Yeah. I'm taking the most insane approach. I'm not going to build a floor or anything like that, Patrick. I'll probably buy that.
So do you have help, or are you guys planning to do this all yourself?
I still have a really good amount of connections here from when I was in the union, and even just people that I've known most of my life. Part of the design of the house is to try and come up with something that could be built relatively simply by one or two people. At one time, I was thinking about panelizing it as opposed to building it all on site. But after running through the energy modeling and kind of landing on the double wall as a happy medium design where I would get the R value that I wanted, but was still something that I could easily build on site, mostly working alone. It kind of took away the advantage of panelizing the house.
It's so we should tell folks what you're referring to with your wall designs. You ran the numbers on a number of different high performance wall assemblies, and you did something that some folks fail to do, and that's you assigned a labor value to weigh the cost of the material and the labor across all these different wall assemblies.
Yeah, I went way off the deep end during quarantine in creating spreadsheets and different formulas for trying to come up with cost of the R value of the wall assembly per square foot. And then I really lost my mind with trying to quantify the labor. The method I came up with was based on, I think the most basic piece of framing a carpenter can build is a standard 2x4 wall. So you would have your 2x4 wall, sheathing of your choice on the outside, your WRB, you'd insulate it and sheetrock it. That's a pretty basic wall assembly that is easy to rationalize in your mind, so you can come up with how long it's going to take you. And what I did was assign to that wall assembly a value of 1.00. So what I did from there was thought about, well, how much more work is it to build a 2x6 wall? Is it a little bit more work because the framing members are bigger? Sure. Is it a little bit heavier to move around? Sure. So I assigned that a value of 1.25 and really just kept escalating it out from there and started thinking about, well, how much work is it to build a wall out of 2x8s in comparison to the 2x4 wall? And just kept going through these spreadsheets and taking every piece of material in a wall and thinking, okay, is that more work in this wall assembly? And you find that things like sheathing are pretty much the same value no matter the wall assembly. So you can just keep assigning that a value of 1.0. And then on something like the double wall, you're really just building two 2x4 walls. So you have two wall sections that each get a value of 1.0. And then I designed the spreadsheet to add all of those up and then also divide that out by the square foot of R value, which is I'm not really sure where I got it. I think I got it from some really nerdy piece on GBA, and I just really liked that that matrix. It seems like a really honest way to quantify if you're actually getting something worthwhile out of an assembly. So I ended up building the spreadsheet with like 7 or 8 different wall designs on it, and costed them all out, and ran what I thought was a reasonable labor score on each wall. And I was really surprised at the results. All of them are really similar. In the end, there isn't that much difference between any of them. And that kind of steered me for a little while to thinking I was going to do a 2x6 wall with mineral wool insulation and 2 layers of EPS foam, until I started thinking about, well, how long is it going to take me to go around the house and put up all this foam, and then use the 8-inch long screws to put the rain screen battens on, when if I was going to do the double wall, all of that can be done while the wall is laying on your deck. And with our house design and having the really tall cathedral ceiling space, that became something that was really important to me, being able to do as much of that work while the wall is laying down as possible, so that I don't have to have a bunch of scaffolding up around the house for a long time and have extra people involved just moving material around.
That's fascinating, man. So I would observe that your insulation expenses are going to be perhaps one of the most significant costs in this double stud wall, because it takes so freaking long to dense pack walls. I've watched it done. It takes days. So the installation time is shifted to your subcontractor. It's not your work you have to do. I mean, am I off base here?
No, I think that's exactly right. The only price I've gotten back so far was right around $4.50 a square foot for the 12-inch wall, which I had reached out to Andy Engel and Ben Bogey and got their opinion on what the price for that should be. And this $4.50 square foot landed and in the mid high end of what Ben told me to expect. So I wasn't really surprised by that, but one of the points of yours that I really agree with is shifting that labor burden over to someone else when you're doing a project like this, mostly on your own, I think is really important. That to me seems like a great time to be outside doing siding or some other outdoor scope of work, while those guys are in there for, as you put it, days on end, dense packing cellulose.
Yeah, looks fun.
I saw
what's
him
it like
doing
to be
it
back
at
on the
Ben's project, and it didn't look fun.
It doesn't look fun. I could see where people would cut corners with that, because you can't tell if they're really filling the walls. It really needs to be someone who's conscientious, I've observed.
Yeah. Yep.
So what's it like to be back on the farm? Are your parents making you do chores? Do you have to get up early and milk the cow, or what's going on?
No, luckily we don't have milk cows. We just sell them purely for beef, which is a much easier type of animal to take care of. My biggest chore that I get stuck doing every once in a while is grinding feed. So my father has this large feed grinder. It kind of looks like a big coffee mill. So we have to shovel corn into it, and then it grinds that up along with whatever else my dad puts in it, some medicated pellets and whatnot. And then we have to unload that into various self feeders around the farm. That's been my biggest chore so far. But I think as soon as we get through the rain today, my dad's going to be cutting hay, which that will be another chore that we'll get to do, unloading hay bales.
So do you guys use the square bales, or do you have to move the round bales around, or is it a mix?
No. So when I was growing up, we did all of the small bale-sized hay bales, the ones that are like 45 or 50 pounds, and then we would stack them in a mow. But he switched over to the large format bales, which are about the size of a small car. So he just goes out there with a tractor and picks them up and stacks them inside the barn.
Does he let you drive his tractors? Because that's the best part of being on a farm.
No, I don't even need two hands to count the people who are allowed to drive the tractors.
It's always that way.
I keep joking to him that he's going to teach my wife how to drive the tractor before he ever lets me drive one.
I just got one more question. And so I've observed you with inexperienced carpenters, and you have a real knack for teaching them. What's the secret? What's the one thing that we can tell folks before we sign off here that you can do to help folks who are entering the trades?
So I think one of the things you have to understand when you're working with someone who's new to the trade or never done that particular type of work, you as their supervisor are the one who has to teach them and lead them, and that the new apprentice, any of the failures that they have, they're not their own failures. They're really your failures. So you have to, as a leader or a lead carpenter, be willing to look within yourself and think critically about problems that you have on your crew and see if you're the cause of it or if there was anything that you could do better to set people up for success. And I think Ben made this point when you were talking to him, that you have to let people screw up and make mistakes, and you have to create a vibe on the crew that that's okay. I like to tell new guys that no one ever learned anything from constant success. So you got to take your screw ups, and you have to be willing to think, what did I learn from this experience, and how is that going to help me improve when we do this task the next time? But to me, that's the most important part of being a lead carpenter or being a leader on a crew or a teacher. I think that in addition to death and taxes, all problems are management problems is the third certainty in life.
It's been such a pleasure talking to you, Ian. I'm so grateful you were on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This was great, Patrick.
And you'll keep us apprised of the progress on your house, I hope.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, definitely. I'm hoping to create some content along the way that would be geared towards somebody who's a DIY person or somebody who wants to build a house on their own, to give them an idea of how to plan and cost and estimate out the project.
That's fantastic. So you sent Kylie and I your preliminary design, I think it was yesterday. So
yep.
I think we're going to talk about that on the regular podcast for those of you listening. If you want to see Ian's new house, we'll have some photographs on the regular podcast on the podcast page.
Oh, that'd be great.
It was great, man.
All right. Good talking to you, Patrick.
Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks to Ian for joining us, and thanks to all of you for listening. Please remember to send us your comments, questions, and suggestions to fhbpodcast@taunton.com. And please like, comment, or review us however you're listening. It helps other folks find our podcast. Stay safe, everybody. Thanks for listening. Happy building.